Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session. Thank you for making the time. As Scott mentioned, these are sessions based on feedback from our customers like yourselves. We have provided a small worksheet to you. If you could fill that up, that would help us in planning next few sessions, which may be closer to your locations. Ken Camp, one of our senior engineers, will be presenting to you on storage best practices. Ken?
Good afternoon, everybody. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay. My name is Ken Kemp. I'm a senior storage escalation engineer in our Broomfield office. What we're going to go over today are some storage best practices to help avoid some pain points that we see in support. The major issues that we find, configuration problems we find when the customers call into the support center. So the things we're going to go over today, we're going to go over some tips on your storage environment, some performance improvements and tuning you can do in that environment, how you can actually monitor to see what type of performance you're getting in your host from your storage, and also some common storage issues. Okay, we're going to go over the storage environment first. I know you guys don't want to hear this. You've probably had to hear it 30 times since you've been here. Backups. Please have backups. When you guys call in and you're suspecting you've lost a VM, it's never going to be a frontline guy that says you lost data. He's going to call me to deliver that message. So I get to be the one to tell you that you've lost data. The other thing about backups, make sure that you have a good strategy that's not a single approach. Make sure if you're going to do LUN snapshots, that's terrific, but you're still looking at a single point of failure, make sure you have another mechanism like tape. And keep in mind, this is also a great mechanism for us to recover more quickly. If you lose a volume and you just need to get a web server up, we might be able to restore that VM in 5 minutes while we work on the LUN for an hour. So it's a much more efficient way to get that VM back online. The other thing, test your backups. Please, because I get this one a lot too. A lot of people don't find out that the backups haven't been running for a month until they go to do a restore because they've lost something. So just make sure that everything's functioning correctly. Okay? Another quick message, and I'm sure most of you know this by now, but we still do get this occasionally. VMware snapshots aren't backups. Don't rely on those for backups. It's a Delta file only. Okay, another big thing that comes up. You want to make sure that you actually know what you have in your environment. How many people here are their own storage admins? So that's about a third of the room. That means you have another guy or a storage team that's actually handling your storage on the back end. So one of the easiest things you can do, call them before you have a problem. Because if your guy, Bob, the storage guy, if you can give him a call and you know who he is, he's going to be much more receptive when you call him with a problem. So open that channel of communication early. Just get to know who is on your storage team, even if it's a few people. The next thing, if you are your own storage admin, and this is also a good message to communicate to your storage admins if you have a group for it, make sure you're following the best practices for your particular vendor. Every major storage vendor will have a best practice document or steps for that particular storage solution. There's very particular items that can be configured to get better performance per array. Another thing on support relationships, make sure you talk to your vendor. Be proactive. They'll let you know what code level you should be running, what new updates are coming. Be familiar with the support process if you guys have to actually call them up and open an SR so that you know what to expect. Whether it's a callback model, you're going to have to wait for it, or you're going to get somebody on the phone right away in an emergency. Just know what to expect in that situation. Also, make sure you keep up to date on obviously on the firmware and software updates for the array. New features are coming out all the time. One of the big ones that's introduced in updates on most arrays is going to be VAI. It's a feature set that's usually shows up after an update. So when we get to that, we'll go over it a little bit more about what that's going to give you. But keep in mind, if you keep up to date on those features, they may already be present in your environment. Okay? Another one that people frequently overlook are HBA updates. They'll update their hosts, they'll update the switch code, if maybe they remember it, but they'll frequently overlook the HBA. I talk to customers all the time who are running 5-year-old code on their HBAs. Doesn't react quite the same way as new code to newer operations. It also helps us identify problems because those HBAs can interpret the errors they're seeing on the fabric a lot better. So make sure you keep up to date on those, give your HBA vendor a call, or even just check out their website and see what's available for your HBAs. That also goes for your NICs, obviously. Okay, so a couple areas of concern here with hard disk performance. This generally goes more for people that aren't their own storage admins and are not real sure what's going on underneath it. So we're going to go over some of the bottlenecks we'll see in those environments. Also, you want to make sure that you see, when you're watching your performance, that you know the difference between a spike and sustained latency. A spike could just be we did our backups too fast or we did too many updates at one time. Sustained latency is more of a problem. So on the hard drive issue, we're going to look at performance versus capacity, right? So generally, the size of the drive, it's not going to scale with the performance of it, typically, right? And these are really rough numbers, but if you need a terabyte of space for a database, let's say, it's pretty easy to just throw together 2 drives, stripe them across. You got your space, but you're not going to get much performance out of that drive. I actually had a customer, and I'll tell you a quick story here, who was deploying VDI. We had the ticket open for a week. He could get to 150 VMs. By the way, if you're out there and you recognize the story, don't throw anything. He'd get to about 150 deployments, and he couldn't understand why the performance just went sideways. So it finally got escalated to me. We took a look at it. Couldn't understand what was going on. The D-average even looked good. The performance looked okay. The array was handling it. So I finally asked him how many disks he had. He stopped for a second, thought about it. 6 SATA disks. Under 150 VMs. And it was running. I mean, the stuff was still going. So just understand what's underneath what you're trying to run and what your workload is. In the same example, if you get smaller drives and you get more physical spindles underneath that LUN to handle the load, you can see you're going to get a lot more operations through on that particular volume. Again, the numbers are rough, but the idea is pretty solid. Again, this is a great place where you can talk to your vendor so you can understand how the array is handling that, how it's spreading it across what disks. Also, be aware of what type of disks are on the back, whether they're SATA, SAS, that kind of thing, so you understand what performance you can get out of them. Okay, a couple improvements and tuning things you can do. VAI, how many of you are running VAI knowingly right now? Oh, so there's a few of you. There's actually a lot more than we saw in the last session. There was only a couple. VAI actually allows us to enable really common, or offload really common operations to the storage array where, frankly, it belongs. The array knows how to handle this. Some of the performance benefits are if we're offloading that work, you're going to get less CPU and memory resource usage on the host itself. You're going to see much faster migrations through SV Motion. Incidentally, that's going to be a terrific help if you're going to be using storage DRS. You're going to get faster deployment or cloning of virtual machines. So if you're spinning out a lot of virtual machines frequently, this is going to help quite a bit. Anybody ever have any problems with SCSI reservation conflicts? Few people? So one of the biggest things in that is going to help resolve those, and we'll go over which particular piece of code is going to help that. And also, you're going to get faster zeroing operations if you're running a lot of Microsoft clusters or doing fault tolerance. So the 3 primitives you're going to see right now in 4.1 are full copy. The first primitive full copy, the way it works essentially is if you go to clone a disk now, we actually go out to your storage, we read a block to the host, then we go back to the storage array and write that block in a new location. It's not very efficient. And it clutters up the fabric or the network. What full copy does is it allows us to engage the array and basically say, I want you to copy from here to here in a new location, go. Let me know when you're done. And the array handles it all on the back end. The performance increase on that is tremendous. The next one is atomic test and set. This is essentially going to replace SCSI 2 reservations, and the way it does it, currently, the way we employ SCSI 2 reservations, when you power on a virtual machine, you create a new file, you take a snapshot, anything that requires us to modify our own metadata in the volume, we have to establish a SCSI 2 reservation on the metadata, make the modification, and release it. Now, that happens really quickly, but if you have a high-density LUN, say you're running 100 VMs in a LUN, and you snap them all across multiple hosts, it causes some contention. You'll start to see effects like you can't power on virtual machines. ATS simply goes for the exact blocks it's looking for, instructs the array it wants to write to that region. It assumes it succeeds, and it will go ahead and follow up with other commands. If it fails, we'll get that subsequent failure, and we'll handle it gracefully. But otherwise, there's no waiting. We just move on. We never engage a SCSI 2 reservation unless there's a failure. We can still fail back to it if there's any kind of other issue going on. You're actually trying to power on a virtual machine at the exact same time in two places. That's pretty much all it's going to hit that. The other one is block zeroing. It's pretty similar to the full copy, except instead of saying we want to clone this block to this block, when you create a new VMDK, whether you know it or not, currently, if you create that new VMDK, we don't actually zero the entire thing. You'll notice if you've ever zeroed a disk, it actually takes a few minutes. We actually have to go to that disk and write a 0 to every space. So what we can do now is we simply tell the array, again, from this block to this block, write zeros, or write same is the actual command, and let me know when you're done. So again, keeps all of the traffic from the host off of the Fabrica network. So some requirements for it. If you're running 4.1 or later, you already have it. It's already running in your environment, and it's testing your array for capabilities. You need to make sure that your storage array is at a firmware level that supports it. Most arrays that didn't originally have them, they've updated the firmware to cover it. But again, you'll want to touch base with your storage vendor to see what level you need to be at. It is enabled by default. So again, it's already running if you're running 4.1 or later. Currently, we're only supporting block devices for this. So iSCSI or Fiber Channel. We do have primitives prepared for NFS and also some new primitives in 5, and we're working with our vendors right now to employ those. You'll probably see them within another 30 to 60 days. You'll begin to see them showing up. One of the biggest improvements in 5 in the primitives is that we're providing better support for thin provisioning. So you can actually thin provision on the array, and currently, in its current implementation, if you run out of space on the array, has anybody ever run out of space on a thin provision volume? Yeah, it's game over. The VMs stop, everything goes down. Currently, or very soon, what this is going to allow the array to do is let us know, hey, I'm running out of space. And it will actually produce an error message for the ESX admin saying, you're running out of space, you need to take care of this. If you don't address that situation, it will actually freeze your VMs for you when you run out of space, so you don't get a hard crash on everything in the environment. So even if you do have to run out of space, if you can't address it quickly enough, it'll be a lot more graceful for you. Okay, and again, you'll want to make sure with your storage vendor which of those primitives are going to be supported and what code level you need to be at. The way you can actually check on this is if you go into the datastore view, you'll see there's actually a column there, the hardware acceleration column. The 3 different states that are listed there, unknown is generally what you're going to see at first. Unknown means that not all 3 of the primitives have failed, possibly one has succeeded. The primitives are tested as they're used. ATS, obviously, when you try to power on a guest, it'll test that almost right away. So if it's there, it'll enable it and continue using it. It won't test the capabilities of the full clone or 0 block until you actually attempt those operations. If you clone a virtual machine, it will attempt to use VAI to do that operation. If it fails, it'll remember that it failed. And again, with zeroing, if all 3 of those operations fail, you'll see that not supported field listed for those data stores. Keep in mind, we do continually retest in case you update your firmware. If it says not supported, it doesn't mean it's not supported forever. If you update your firmware and an ATS command succeeds, it will attempt to retest for those. Supported means that obviously all three of those have passed and you're using VAI for all of those operations. Okay, just a quick overview on the pluggable storage architecture. VMware NMP is generally what you're going to see. VMware SATP or a storage array type plugin, that's generally going to vary by which array you're actually running. So you'll see a specific one loaded for whatever specific array type you have. And then, of course, our path selection policy. You'll notice there that we've left space for third-party vendors to actually produce these. So you want to make sure to talk to your vendor to find out if you have one that's available and optimized for your storage solution. Okay? We're going to quickly go over the three types just because we get a lot of questions about what these actually mean. What do these actually do in my environment? So the three policies you're going to see from us are either fixed, round robin, or most recently used. Most recently used, let's see, we actually got something for that. So most recently used is generally going to be on active passive arrays. You'll generally see it not always in older configurations, but generally that's where you're going to see it. Most recently used, the best way it was described to me by one of our instructors, is if you're driving to work one day and you find out the road's closed, you'll take an alternate route, right? Most recently used assumes it's just going to keep using that route. Once it fails over, it's going to assume the road's closed forever, and it's going to keep trying to go the other way. If the other way subsequently closes, it'll fail back, trying to see if that old route is open, but otherwise it's just going to flop back and forth. Fixed, we're generally going to see on active-active arrays. It actually gives you the capability to do manual load balancing and select which path you want to use. So if there is a failover on your way to work, you have to cut off on a side road. The next morning, you're going to attempt to go back down that main road, right? It's always going to fail back to a preferred path. There's a couple considerations with it, and we'll go over those in a minute. But generally, that's one of the best policies we see for people to actually handle some sort of load balancing on their own. Another issue that you'll see pop up on those is Alua. Mustafa, I'm sure most of you know who that is. He actually wrote a book on storage for VMware, and they're actually providing the chapter on Alua from the book in the VMware store out on the floor. So make sure you check it out. That will be free. I think the book's coming out in February. Alua is important if you're going to run round robin on fixed pathing. If we see all four paths as active and you don't turn on Alua, there is a small chance you're going to end up flooding a back channel if you have that kind of a mechanism in your array. So make sure, again, to talk to your storage vendor to find out if you need that ability enabled. It's also very handy in emergency situations, very useful feature. Round robin is actually going to utilize multiple connections. So if you actually have multiple active connections to your storage array, again on that same driving analogy, it just means you're going to pick a new path every day, every available path. So you'll spread out your workload. You'll spread it out across the queues, across the devices, and generally you'll see a performance enhancement using round robin. We will support you running round robin on any device. However, we defer to the vendor. So the vendor has to okay it, but as long as the vendor okays it, we're going to support it, whatever device it's running on. Okay, and then obviously talk to your vendor about other solutions for multipathing. So some of the best practices on this particular issue, make sure you're using the same PSP across your hosts for each LUN. They can vary by LUN, but each LUN should have the same path selection policy on every one. You don't want MRU on one and fixed on another. This is a pretty common config issue, especially in large environments, simply because you actually have to go through the pathing and verify it's going to be the same on all the boxes, right? Some of our vendors provide some great tools for that that'll help you line those up. So again, make sure you've talked to them on that. Also, you want to make sure that you're using the correct path selection policy, whether it's active-passive, active-active, or you're going to use active-active with Alua. This generally varies by the firmware level on your array, and you'll see it change through newer versions of firmware, whether you're able to change over to active-active, and whether you're able to actually use Alua. Okay, so multipathing on iSCSI, how many people are running iSCSI? Okay, and keep your hands up if you've actually configured multipathing. Okay, so it's actually a good percentage of you guys. So multipathing is actually going to give us the ability to utilize as many active paths as we can. One of the most common mistakes we see there's some really old documentation floating around that still recommends more than one VM kernel port per NIC. It's not really accurate. It's not really helpful. And we'll hear this a lot from customers that they're uncertain how they should configure that. Our recommendation is always one VM kernel port group per physical NIC that you're going to be using. So no matter what else you hear, if you call us, that's going to be our recommendation for it. You can run into issues otherwise. Also, you want to follow the best practices guidelines in both the iSCSI config guide, and also, again, your vendor is going to provide a best practices document depending on the connection type. Make sure you read those. I can't stress that enough. There's a lot of really useful information on your particular array types. Also, if you haven't configured it, it looks like most of you have, but we do provide pretty clear instructions in the iSCSI config guide on how to do that. Storage I/O control. Let's see if this is the same as the other group. How many people are using storage I/O control? There's a lot more people here using that too. We had about 3 people in the last one. This is actually a great way to monitor for sustained increases in latency on your array. If you guys are pushing your array a little bit, storage I/O control will actually help you control who's getting access to that storage. We can actually normalize it using shares across hosts. Right now, you can normalize it on a single host. They'll all fight over the available bandwidth that one host has. SIOC gives you the ability to actually monitor that across hosts. And we'll look at a diagram here. So if we say this red machine on the first host is like an Exchange server, the other one's just a web server. If this yellow one is just doing data mining, it's going to get the full benefit of that second connection, the second host. It's going to use every bit of I/O that it can to get to the storage array at the expense of your Exchange server. So if it's completely congested, you can see that your low priority data mining VM is going to get priority over your Exchange server, or it's actually going to get more done. SIOC actually allows you to assign shares just like you would for memory or CPU time, and it'll actually normalize it across those boxes. You can see in the next diagram that now we can minimize what that data mining VM is doing. We can make sure that the critical box gets the I/O throughput that it needs. Okay, so some performance monitoring stuff. Especially if you're not your own storage admin or you're just looking at the VI client, the first thing we're going to recommend is that you actually take a look at the statistics provided in Virtual Center. You can take a look at the latency and also the I/O or IOPS for each device or data store through those graphs. You do need to take a look at your historical availability, and you may need to alter that to actually get to see that data over a period of time. So you want to keep that in mind. Also, you're going to be getting read-write latency and then also physical device latency. We actually split those out, so you can look at either data stores or just at the physical devices themselves. There will be a link provided in these slides for that admin guide, and that'll show you how to configure those graphs for obtaining that information. Just a quick look at what they're going to look like in the actual Virtual Center themselves. You can see you can pull up data over the past week and actually get an idea of when you're seeing spikes, when you're seeing low spots in the I/O. So you can figure out if your backup window is too long or if you're seeing a really sustained increase of activity in the morning, when that's going to drop off, that kind of thing. Okay, a couple more examples of how you're going to see those in there. The most common one you're going to see when you call in, the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is, do we have a PuTTY window open to the host? So the first thing I'm going to look at is ESX top. ESX tops is going to provide you real-time information on the command line about what kind of latency we're seeing, what kind of throughput we're seeing, and also whether the kernel or the guest are actually having problems with it. So the things we'll go over real quick are the commands or IOPS, the D average, K average, and G average. And we'll go over these in a diagram here in a second. NFS latency we picked that up in 4.1. Before that, we only handled it as network traffic, so it was impossible to split out. In 4.1, we actually allow better tracking of that. and that there is a bit of an initiative to provide more information specifically for your NFS traffic so you can track that better. Okay. We do also have some documentation on using ESXtop. If you don't know how, there is also a pretty good KB on it. So the three things you're actually going to be looking at, when you're in ESXtop, you can select either the adapters themselves, the disk devices, or the disks per VM. And then you can select different statistics you actually want to see for it. The way we're going to look at this, so commands is generally going to be your throughput. The D average is actually the device average. The way that's determined is how long it takes for us to send a command out of the physical device, or HBA or NIC if it's iSCSI, and receive an acknowledgement that that command completed. The K average is how long the actual kernel, the VM kernel, is having to process that I/O. So the VM passes the I/O over to the VM kernel. We actually have to process it, push it through the storage stack, and get it out to the device. So that's how long we're actually going to take to do that. The guest is really just an aggregate of the two. It's how the Windows VM, for example, is going to see that traffic, how long it's taking. So it's really pretty much the D average plus the K average. So some latency values, some of the best stuff you're going to see on there. Obviously, lower is better. Latency, that's always the case, right? Some general rules of thumb for it. 10 milliseconds is what we're looking for. 20 milliseconds or higher, if you're seeing it sustained, we probably want to take a look and see what's going on. If you're seeing fast spikes, that's not generally an issue. It just means you were trying to do a big write, and it might have backed up a little bit. Not a tremendous problem. If you see a sustained increase over 20, something's going on. Generally, if we see a true problem going on, you'll see it spike into the hundreds. And you definitely want to give us a call. And also, generally, your vendor a call, and we'll get together with them and find out what's going on. So, aborts. 5,000 milliseconds. We send a command. If we don't get a response back from the storage array in 5,000 milliseconds, we abort it. You're going to see a couple aborts in your logs. We get some customers who actually go to the command line and they will review the error messages they see. And it's a little bit like WebMD. Have you guys ever gone to WebMD? You spend 15 minutes there and you have every disease on earth. I swear, it's terrible. I've actually had customers call and they want to root cause a single abort in the middle of the night during backups. A single abort here and there, generally, it's not going to be a problem. Almost universally, it's not going to be a problem. If you start seeing pages of them and you're seeing aborts constantly, 5, 10, 20, 30 minutes, give us a shout. We'll take a look at it. We'll determine what's going on. Is it just the backup window's too short? You're trying to do too much at one time? Do we have something just pushing too hard? We can find those things out. Just don't panic over one. Okay, so some other things, and again, we're getting back to your vendors, but I really like our vendors, so there's a lot of tools that they provide that can access our APIs directly. Since we're speaking about APIs, and I didn't bring it up during the backups, how many people in this room are still using VCB? I see about 5 or 6. I assume you guys have a plan to migrate off that by now? It's definitely on life support at this point. So there's not going to be any more updates for it. We will still help you. If VCB does not work and you're using it as a customer, we want to help you. But understand that there's not going to be any new bug fixes or new features provided in that. We created the vStorage APIs on the back end of the host so that the backup products can actually now directly communicate with the host. They can ask for snapshots. They can remove the snapshots. There's a tremendous amount that can be accomplished through those APIs. And the vendors have spent a ton of time developing utilities to do exactly that. So make sure you understand what's available to you. What tools can you have? Okay, there's also some virtual center plugins, some really useful tools that you can actually install into your virtual center, into your client. So you can actually use those tools to help maintain your storage. So if those are available to you, by all means, use them. Okay, some really common storage issues we run into. I know I said this before. You probably already see it already. Snapshots, still not backups. Don't do it, please. You want to make sure you're doing regular monitoring of your snapshots. There's a KB on it. You can configure some alarms for it, just to have an idea of what's going on with them. You also want to limit, generally, you want to limit your snapshots to 2 or 3 in depth. The further you get into snapshots, the more snapshots you have, the further through that stack of snapshots we have to read to complete I/O. So you'll begin to see some performance degradation in there. So make sure you're not getting too deep and too large. Keep an eye on what you're actually running, or how long you're running those, and the depth that you're running those at. Sorry. Before you go and make any changes to your virtual disks, this happens quite a bit, before you increase them, especially before you remove them and re-add them, make sure you delete those snapshots. Commit them. One of the most common support calls we get is somebody wanted to disconnect a disk momentarily. So they go in, they edit the virtual machine, they remove it, they don't delete it from disk. By the way, there is no undelete, so make sure you're really meaning to delete something before you choose delete from disk. But then they'll go and try to reconnect that disk. If the disk is running on snapshots, they'll call in and suddenly say, well, all my data's here, but it's 3 months old. We can fix that. Make sure you call us right away. Power the virtual machine back off immediately and give us a call. If you continue making changes to it, or if you say, I'm going to call in a week, I'll just leave it running, you'll alter that disk enough that we can't fix the snapshot issue and we'll end up losing the data. That is one of the most common issues we still see. So just be careful when you're making changes to the disks on your VMs if you have snapshots there. Be very aware of them. If you're not sure if your snapshot's committed, has anybody here actually committed snapshots and ended up still having them? A few. Snapshot manager says there's nothing there. Make sure, if you're unsure at all for whatever reason, just jump into the datastore browser and take a look. Snapshots are pretty distinctive. They'll be 0001, 0002 for whatever disk, or they might say demotion. There's a couple different instances of things they might be named, but they'll definitely look out of place. You'll have a pretty good idea what they are. If your snap manager says they don't exist, generally you can just take a new snapshot and hit delete all, and it'll clean it up. If you're uncertain in any way, or you don't feel comfortable doing it, give us a shout. We can help you with that. It's not a problem. Also, as a general rule, don't use snapshots for more than 24 to 72 hours. Generally, when you're manually taking a snapshot, obviously you take snapshots all the time for backups for most products, but generally if you're taking it, it's because you're applying, let's say, a Windows update, and you want to make sure when the update completes that it doesn't BSOD on the way back up. Well, once it doesn't BSOD and you run it for 24 or 48 hours, you know it's pretty good, you've checked all the blogs and you know nothing's exploding or on fire, go ahead and delete the snapshot. Just make sure you don't forget about it. Those snapshots grow over time. They're deltas, and they can fill up your volume. And again, filling up your storage is bad. You want to be aware of what you have and what your capacity is. So some improvements in 4U2 and subsequent to that, so 4.1, we've actually changed the behavior of how the snap is committed. We can actually commit them more efficiently so you don't need this monstrous amount of space to clean up large snapshots, especially if there's several of them. And in 5, we've actually introduced several new monitors that will actually go back and alert you that even if the snapshot monitor says that there's nothing there, the snap manager says that there's no snaps there, it'll still check to see if there's Delta files there. If there are, it'll actually throw an alarm for you. So you'll know that you have to browse into that data store, jump into the command line, take a look. You'll actually see those snaps still there. So again, you can employ the take a new snapshot, hit delete all, and make sure they actually go, or give us a shout. We can figure out why those were left behind. There is a best practices document on this, obviously, a KB. And then if you're not really certain how they work or where I/O is going at the time or anything like that, take a look at this KB. Really explains how they run, how they work, where the data is going, and how they're committed. So another misconfiguration issue we generally see. One of the biggest ones, the array firmware doesn't match what version of ESX you're running. Our vendors have very specific documents showing what firmware level you should be running for what version of ESX. So make sure you're running the right firmware. Again, if you're not your own storage admin, that's one of the best opening questions when you call your storage guy, hey, what firmware are we running? What type of LUNs, how many disks? Just jot all that down. It saves a lot of time if you ever have an issue with it and call us. HBA, fiber channel switch, and physical NICs, same thing. Make sure your firmware and your drivers are updated, especially if you're running 10 gig cards. We're seeing a lot of 10 gig cards showing up, and there's a lot of updates and firmware updates, both driver updates and firmware updates for them. So make sure you're running the latest code. If you're unsure about anything, check our HCL. If it's critical that you're at a certain firmware revision, we'll let you know in that guide. Another one is inconsistent path policy that we were talking about earlier. So we'll see people with MRU or active-active. One of the worst you can do is active-active with the wrong preferred paths. I mentioned some utilities earlier. We're actually spending time aligning those. If you actually pick different paths to different SPs, you'll actually end up with a path rashing condition. Newer arrays are actually really good at handling that. They'll try to stay online for you, but sooner or later, they're going to go down. It's inevitable. So make sure those are configured correctly and that you're following the best practices for those. LUN detected as a snapshot. This one is fairly common. It's generally when you either update your firmware on your storage array or you make a configuration change to the LUN under ESX and then reboot the box. You won't mount a LUN suddenly. The reason for that is we detected the change and we believe it's actually a different device. We're not mounting it to try to save what we've determined to be your backup. It's intentional. We don't want to mount a snapshot and destroy backup data for you. There are ways to resolve that. There's really easy command line methods to do it. And also in the actual GUI itself, when you try to add storage, it'll ask you, it'll tell you that it's a snapshot volume and give you the option to resignature it. If you just need to mount it to get a VM online, terrific, you can force mount it. But at some point, you have to resignature that volume. We frequently get customers who will call in 3 or 4 months later and say, hey, this volume disappeared again. And we'll go back and look at their SRs and we'll find out there's been 2 in the past where we've had the exact same problem and they just forgot to resignature it. So make sure if you do run into this error that you know at some point in your next maintenance window you're going to want to resignature that volume. The reason it's important to have a maintenance window, and if you check the KB for the snapshots, you'll understand all the limitations, but there can't be any I/O to the volume at the time. You also have to re-add your VMs to inventory, so there's a little bit of an impact there. You want to be aware of that before you go forward with resignatures. Okay, APD, anybody? A couple of those? So, APD is a newer condition we ran into in 4. If you pull a data store out from an ESX host and it doesn't know what you're doing, if you just unpresent it from the storage array, for example, ESX tries to remount that volume. It believes there's VMs running on it. We have to assume there is, and our philosophy is we want to keep your virtual machines up at all costs. In 4, it was a little overzealous about it, and you'd actually see the host disconnect from Virtual Center. Caused some really unintended behaviors. So we've modified the way we actually do that in later versions. It's a little more graceful. We can tolerate that condition longer, but you still want to make sure if you need to remove a volume that you follow the best practices for removing it. There's a KB with very specific steps on how to mask those out. And also, if you're just going to delete those volumes, you can do that through the GUI. It's an automated process. Make sure that the rescan's actually successful, and make sure if you're going to make changes to your environment like that, to rescan immediately so the hosts understand what's been added or removed from the environment. Okay, the rescan option. Okay, so just real quick, the things we've gone over. Obviously, make sure you talk to your storage admins and your vendors. Make sure you know what's in your environment. Make sure you have all the applicable performance improvements and tuning that you can in the environment, that you're using all of the features you have access to. Make sure you understand what normal performance is for your environment. And also, if you have those the common storage issues, they're pretty easy to resolve. Worst case, give us a shout. We can help you out with them. All righty. Do we have any questions?
I do.
Shoot.
You mentioned now that we should not be using multiple solutions for multipathing. right now what we're doing is we just implemented our power path, PVE. Okay. On one host, we just want to try it and test it out. And you said, and so all our other ones are just using the native MRU right now.
Okay.
So, are we jeopardizing ourselves by doing that?
We're not. Short term, that's not an issue. And it is actually supported to do that short term.
Okay. How long is short term? Month?
A couple weeks, month. Right. Yeah. Okay. Whatever you need to make sure you get the results. But make sure you understand that if you start to see issues there, that you need to look at that first.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Sorry, we have some additional people here, by the way. We have Jennifer Schrei from NetApp, and also Nathan Balls, who I want to thank for helping with the slides. Probably should have got that out in the beginning, but go ahead.
Speaking of PowerPath, what's going to be the support with version 5, ESXi 5 and PowerPath? Is there going to be a new version of PowerPath coming, or just go ahead and upgrade and install it?
That's a question for EMC. We are going to support
You're owned by EMC, right?
Yeah, but we're not EMC. Just to clarify. Yeah, no, I'm sure there will be, because I've actually seen documentation on them working on it. So, but it really is best answered by them.
All right.
Anybody else? Oh, shoot.
When you said that the VAAI subsystem says that a data store is unsupported because it failed specific tests, and it will recheck that?
Yes.
What's the periodicity on that? Is it every time? And
right off the top of my head, I believe it's every 21,000 IOPS, we will attempt an ATS command on the array.
So depending on how hard you hit it, it could be daily or once a year.
Well, 21,000 IOPS, you should probably hit that at least daily, I hope. Anybody else?
Yeah.
Oh, there you are.
So this is mainly a NetApp person question. I'm glad they're here. SQL database on a VM. So fiber channel and 1 gig NICs on the blades. So iSCSI, RDMs, or VMFS.
Oh. Can we get this mic turned on up here?
Can you get it turned way up? Can you guys hear me at all? So I've been talking for like 6 days. No, I actually went bed early. If you can come up, I can answer that a lot better. But basically, you can run SQL Snap Manager for SQL products on VMFS or NFS data stores. We don't care. So for backing up, doesn't matter. For performance, it would depend what you guys have on the network. Performance is going to depend on what else is on those networks. So it's variable. Sorry.
Data store with, oh,
there you go.
I thought it was off. On a VMFS data store with multiple extents, how is that written to? Is it written to, does it start at the first one and just work its way through them logically, or does it write to all the extents simultaneously?
It will actually spread it across them.
Okay, cool.
Yep, it's the whole purpose is obviously to avoid hotspots, and we want to make sure we're getting the performance out of using multiple devices. We will spread it. And obviously, if you guys have any more questions, I will be at the Genius Bar tomorrow morning for a couple hours. Yeah, and we'll be here in the room. We've got the room for the rest of the evening. So if you have any more questions, just come right on up.